Story number 2, Final Fantasy VIII's director says he changed the junction battle system if it was remade. We couldn't have a better correspondent on this week's
Chris
episode.
String.
Did you change this? Did you add this because you knew that I was going to be on?
Oh, the second this came on the site, I was like, well, here we
Right.
go. Speaking to IGN ahead of the game's 25th anniversary, Yoshinori Kitase was asked how he would improve the game should Square Enix ever decide to give it the same remake treatment as Final Fantasy. He replied that specifically the stat-focused junction system would be top of his proposed changes. Quote, I think you may remember we had the junction system in Final Fantasy VIII, and the thing about that system was the enemies leveled up in line with what the player's level was. And obviously, you had to then use the junction system and how you customize that and overcome the challenge there. And I think it was a very difficult system for some people to get into, depending on player skills. Sometimes they just didn't work out the best way of doing it. Final Fantasy VIII correspondent Ben Starr, how would you feel about a change to the junction system? And furthermore, do you think we're going to get Final Fantasy VIII in the Final Fantasy VII treatment?
I think we are not going to get Final Fantasy VIII in the Final Fantasy VII treatment.
That's
because
official.
If you think about how long it's taken them to remake Final Fantasy VII,
Yep.
Final Fantasy VIII is a bigger game than Final Fantasy VII.
It would take 40 years.
Yes. So the answer to that is no. But it is nice. And by the way, this isn't any confirmation I don't work for Square Enix in that capacity. I know nothing. But I would say no.
He's winking. He's winking at the
I'm
camera. He's winking in the podcast
That's
room.
exactly
Did you
what
say
I'm doing.
winking?
Winking.
Yeah, okay.
No, I'm also the other thing as well. I don't think we will, and I get it a lot because I have been very vocal in my love for Final Fantasy VIII. We even spoke beforehand about how we're talking about games that we just hold in huge high regard because they are so influential on our lives. And 8 is that game for me. It's the game that got me into video games in a way that I hadn't been before. It made me see the possibilities of what video games could be, and I'm forever thankful for that game for kind of changing my life and introducing me to the franchise. And I often get people saying, well, it's just actually technically it's actually the worst. And I'm going, well, cool, that's fine if you don't like it. And I have been very vocal about it, and there have been lots of people who've actually come up out of the woodwork saying, I also like Final Fantasy VIII. In fact,
There are dozens of
Other
them.
other creeps like Chris Scullion, he
Yeah.
loves Final Fantasy VIII.
Well, I've recently, alongside Holly Bennett, we have co-written an article in the next Lost in Cult, the Lock-On Lost in
nice.
Cult, about Final Fantasy VIII and how it's okay to like Final Fantasy VIII now.
How do you co-write an article?
One word
Do you
each.
do a paragraph each?
It's a bit like those things where you fold the piece of paper like that and then just write a sentence one after another. No, we basically sat in a room and talked about all the things that we love and then kind of collated it into a thing. And it's the creative process. Try it sometimes, VGC. It's fun.
Not for us.
The junction system, people hate it, but I quite like it. I think it's fun. I think people feel it's so different from the systems that they understand before, which is essentially like leveling up. But obviously, as they said, when you level up, enemies level up with you. People felt like it's a very easy thing to cheese. It is. You can actually become almost invincible right at the beginning of the game if you know how to do it. The draw system, people didn't really like. If they were going to remake Final Fantasy VIII, a bit like Final Fantasy VII, they would find a way of refining the system. They wouldn't make a one-for-one remake. And I actually think the junction system, the idea of taking spells and then attaching them to various stat attributes, is a really interesting thing to explore. It's not something that you would circumvent. It's something that you would adapt and change and utilize in 2024, 2025 if you were to make it. I think it's really interesting. Of course they change it. They've changed the way that you use, how you fight in Final Fantasy VII Remake.
Yeah.
You'd find a way that takes the junction system and then makes it more user-friendly, but also keeps the essence of what that is. And I think it's really exciting. We level gate most things in RPGs nowadays anyway. So, you're going to have, if you're level 28, it doesn't really matter. If you're also level 28, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to beat something of that. You have to find intelligent ways of navigating that. And that's what makes for interesting gameplay. And I think the junction system is perfectly teed up for that. So, why not? I think don't get rid of it, but adapt it and change it for the 21st century.
As a Final Fantasy czar, if they were to do another remake after 7, what one do you think has obviously the game in that series with the biggest cultural cachet is 7. They've done that now. What's
Yes.
number 2?
And which character would you play?
Yeah.
Um,
Are you going to remake 16?
just remake it. Yeah, remake it. Next
Director's
year.
cut of 16.
Yeah.
For Xbox?
Yeah. No, what would I? I'd love to see Final Fantasy IV remade.
4, okay.
I'd love to see one of those games. I mean, they've already remade it. Someone will say, "You've already remade it." It's like they have. They remade it for the DS. But I would love to see the same remake treatment given to some of the classics, which would be really interesting. And a smaller title that isn't going to necessarily take a huge amount of time. People want 6. I was at a recent masterclass with Yoshinori Kitase, and someone said, "When are they going to remake 6?" And he was basically like, "We're not." Because it's
Is
just
that the
too
one where he
big.
said it would take 10 years to do it?
Yeah, because these games, they were able to create the scope of these games because we talked about, the way in which you had the beautiful kind of like painted backgrounds, and you could create scope that you could imagine. It was like reading a book almost.
The blueprint sort of
Yeah.
there, right?
Yeah, and now I think just how difficult it is to recreate those scales is best exemplified in what will become the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy. If people want AAA, expansive, open world, exciting, dynamic gameplay from these old games that were working within their own constraints, the constraints of what video games are now is massively different.
I do wonder if they might actually go and remake some of like 8 and 9 and 10. Because, I mean, you look at the kind of, I mean, you'll be able to talk more to this, Chris, from a business perspective, but they're in that cadence now, aren't they? Like they have a new Final Fantasy, then they have a Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1, they have another new Final Fantasy. It's the Capcom kind of rhythm that they're in, right? They have a new Resident Evil, then they have a remake, and they have a new. And to your point, it's easier to make those in theory because you have the blueprint already, you have the characters, you have the world,
and now you've got the engine.
But obviously, they're much bigger scope, those games, than a Resident Evil style linear action game. But what do you think they'll do that, Chris?
I think they probably will, but they're going to get diminishing returns, right? It's like Resident Evil when they did 2, and then 4. You've done it now, right? Because as much as the other games are great, you're never gonna hit those sort of sales numbers.
But even if you don't, it's just like it's something for them to keep busy with, right?
Yeah, but
guys, go and do that.
It's what you said with Final Fantasy. You can sit there in Resident Evil 2, Resident Evil 3, and Resident Evil Code Veronica, and you could probably knock that out in 18 months with a relatively small team and make some decent money on it. I don't know how if you can do that with Final Fantasy. I think that's a lot harder.
They do have. Obviously, we've got. I mean, it was announced a couple of years ago. Is the Dragon Quest III HD 2D remake that they're doing, and obviously with Octopath Traveler 2, which I do think is one of the greatest games of last year. Go and play it if you haven't. I think the art style of Octopath Traveler is amazing. What they can do and how you can have something that seems. We said it's how you remember these games being. Octopath feels incredibly current, but also has that nod to nostalgia. And I think if you're going to remake a lot of these games, and they did it when I think it was the 6-pixel remaster, where they remade the opera scene in that kind of HD 2D style, at least alluded to it a little bit. If you were going to remake those games, it might be interesting to do it in that way.
Yeah, and that depends on who you're going for, right? So if your plan is, we're going to remake this game because we want to get the people who bought it last time around to buy it again, you don't actually have to do too much because people want, I think, you want that thing where you want the game, it needs to be remade, but as long as it feels like they remember it, then that's fine. So you just sort of you have to be relatively...
It's like Metroid Prime Remastered, right?
Yeah.
It's pretty much sold what the original did.
Yeah, and it is, Metroid Remastered is a lot better than it, but it feels like, actually, this is what I remember, even though it's obviously a lot better. Whereas if you're doing Resident Evil 7, I think the ambition for 7 was so much bigger. Same with 2, actually, Resident Evil 2 and Final Fantasy 7, is the ambition was so much bigger than just talking to all the people that bought these games back in the 90s. I think it was about bringing in new people and introducing them to that story because there was a lot of, the budgets for those games wouldn't have been far off the full AAA release. So, and obviously they did massive numbers as well. So it depends. But I think problem with Final Fantasy, I think 7 is the one, right? It's the one that
It does feel like multi-platform's the way for them going forward, doesn't it? I mean, they've got the new CEO who's come in. They're supposedly rethinking all their pipeline, and allegedly multi-platform's a big part of that, and it kind of needs to be, right? If they're making those games, they need to be on everything.
Yeah, but that's just PlayStation now, isn't it? Isn't that just?
Well, but they don't release them.
Xbox
they don't release
is
them on
dead,
PC either,
confirmed.
right?
They
Which
do
is-
eventually.
Which seems mad. Eventually.
Yeah, but that's a weird situation. People work.
Especially with the new Switch is more capable. Later this year you can include that as well.
Yeah.
I was waiting for a Crystal Chronicles. Did they do a Crystal Chronicles remake? I was going to make that joke.
They
and I thought-
remastered it and it did not go well.
I'm not a Final Fantasy guy at all.
Yeah.
But I'm
Literally.
really nostalgic for that game because it launched with GBASP. Did it? It launched because I've got because when GBASP came out in Japan, they launched a Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles GBASP. Like it's a pearl, looks like it's made of pearls, like a white one. So I've got that, and I've got the game, never been played, like with nice little.
What so as you? I mean, we've had this conversation before about you not being a Final Fantasy fan. What is it to you that is not attractive to it? Is it just
The
something?
voice actors mostly.
I think I've missed the boat now.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned earlier you're playing the new Like a Dragon, which I really want to play.
Yeah.
I haven't even finished Prince of Persia yet. It just the more I go, it keeps going. The game won't
Prince
end.
of Persia is Prince of
it's
Persia, The Lost
amazing.
Crown is like Elden Ring, where it just keeps getting
keeps
bigger
going.
and bigger and bigger, and you're like, what?
just want
You
it to
open the
end
map
now.
and there's like a whole
Yeah.
extra like pirate ship section, and
There-
you're like, what's going on
There's
here?
that
Like,
bit where you just see the extra bits that are really far away on the map, and you're thinking, how the am I going to get there?
I've just fallen on the opposite train tracks, right? It just in my age, my timeline. I wasn't a big PS1 guy, so I missed all those games. The only games I really played on PS1 is like Resident Evil, Silent Hill games, and probably a couple of others. So then you get to GameCube, original Xbox. You're not playing Final Fantasy on those.
No.
Then you're on 360. You're not playing Final Fantasy on those. And now
excuse
I'm
me, Final Fantasy 13 on Xbox 360.
yeah, like
Come on, now.
tons later. Yeah, and again, they're not. The onboarding's not great by
Yeah.
that point. Come and play Final Fantasy 13 too. Like
Yeah.
what?
The
So how many
messaging
games-
is so difficult with these games because I think, when we were doing the press for Final Fantasy 16, I was amazed at how many times I would be asked, do I have to have played the other ones? Now, for me, as a fan of Final
You know
Fantasy,
that they're
I
all
go,
original
well,
stories,
what
yeah.
a stupid question. Why are you asking me that? And then I take for granted, actually, that I'm so in the weeds. Of course I know that. And why would a person who's taken no interest in this franchise, unlike me, who's like has a forensic interest in this franchise, and you're talking about onboarding, and when you have a series that is increasingly going 13, 14, 15 and then doing offshoots of that, it's very difficult to message that this is essentially an anthology series. And I think them cashing in on the power and the nostalgia, it is a nostalgia cash in of 7. They just happen to be excellent video games, but they are banking on the people who have played these games, loved these games. This is the game that celebrities played when they were younger. This is the game that Robert Pattinson said that this moment was the most important thing. This is what is it Nia DaCosta spoke about it when talking about the Marvels, which she directed. Like these are filmmakers who make films now played Final Fantasy VII. So it's cashing on that nostalgia and then trying to say, guess what? Have the experience that we all had when we were kids now and get new people in. And that's what they're trying to do now. Can they do that with another game? I don't know.
I watched Advent Children though.
Loved
that
it.
was a nice entry point. I don't
Yeah.
really remember
Weirdly-
it, to be honest.
Weirdly enough, I found out like I was not a Final Fantasy guy until 13. Weirdly enough, but before that, I saw action figures of Cloud in Forbidden Planet in Glasgow, and I was like, that is the coolest
The
motherfucker
thing
in
is,
the world. I just want to
it's
play
pop
as
culture,
him.
right?
Yeah.
That game is pop culture. I'm nostalgic for those
Yeah.
characters, and those themes, because it would have been it's in every magazine, it's on every video, and
I would say when kind of listing the top most iconic characters in all of video games, I reckon Cloud would make it.
Easy.
I think the silhouette alone. I mean, the silhouette
Absolutely.
of those. I think it's probably one of the most iconic casts of all time. You could be the silhouette of every single character and know who they are because they're so of an archetype. And I think you've obviously got Mario, you'd have Sonic, but I do think Cloud would be there.
And
in that
again, coming
list.
from someone who's doesn't play these games, probably my favourite E3 moment, and I was in the room, was the remake trailer.
Yeah.
When again it was all silhouette, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And everyone went insane.
Hip hop
Guy-
gamer standing up, spinning his
You
title
will not
tail.
get. You will never ever top as a trio. Last Guardian, Final Fantasy VII remake,
I was
Shenmue 3.
I was sitting on back then. The PlayStation was in as like a stadium thing. That press conference.
Were you at the
and-
top? Were you?
Well, no. You had this. If you said you were a journalist, they stuck you in like some seats. But if you said you were a blogger, I never understood why. They gave you a table with power. And I found this out a couple of years before. So I always said I was a blogger, and I got this table, and I was next to this guy when Final Fantasy VII was announced. And we're British, so we're always a bit like, oh yeah, that's pretty cool. But the guy next to me kicked his chair back. He fell to his knees and held his hands and he went, "Oh my god, oh my god!" And I was sitting next to my boss at the time. I just looked at each other. And went, it's like, but it was intoxicating that atmosphere around that announcement.
Because also they bank on other people's excitement for something, getting you excited for it. You know,
But he does. Like I feel that, like
Yeah.
vicariously. I feel that. Like even the Summer Game Fest last year, the Final Fantasy 16 event they had. Were you at that? Right?
Yeah.
The big they had it was like a movie lot, right? Like a
They
campus or something.
did the whole thing. The
It was
giant
mad.
Yeah.
Like I was just there, like just enjoying the electricity.
I suppose the purpose of that sort of marketing, and it works, is to go, this is an amazing club. This is an amazing experience. Come and be a part of it. Look how much it's affected these people. Come and join in. And, you know, it's not some people are going to feel excluded because they're going to feel like, well, you really care about it. Yakuza being one of them. We spoke about it beforehand. I started playing it Like a Dragon 7 because people loved it so much, but I could see it as an entry point to get into the franchise because I understood turn-based
Same,
combat.
yeah.
And I've gone, well, this is amazing, but it's how do you convert those people into it? And I think, you know, when we're like getting it a little bit back to Final Fantasy, it's like, how do you draw more people into it? Let's see, we're about to go under. Final Fantasy 7 is one of the most important video games of all time. And they are banking on that being a thing. And by all accounts, it's going to be from what I've played so far, it's a great video game, you know. So I'm excited to see how well it does. I think it's an expensive endeavor, but one that's worth you know doing because they know that people love Final Fantasy 7.
Do you know what else is nice as well as someone from the outside is that I feel like I want to get involved. That community around Final Fantasy just seemed really nice as well. Like doesn't come with a lot of the baggage that you get from other fandoms, right? Like I know quite a few people who run kind of Final Fantasy big RPG sites or Final Fantasy fan sites, and it just seems lovely.
Yeah. I think with all there are going to be people who are very passionate in certain ways. I think that one thing I've recognized is in this anything, Final Fantasy included, Resident Evil, anything. People want you to love their franchise the way that they love it. So the people who sometimes can add a bit of toxicity is if they see someone mishandling that franchise and not loving it the way that they love it. If you come in and you take it for granted, you know, I was so worried starting saying I am Clive in Final Fantasy 16 because I was worried that people would go, well, you don't love this franchise in the way that I love this franchise. Get out. And actually, people have been lovely, and my experiences have been really, really wonderful with the entire community. And I feel very lucky to be a part of it. But, you know, you're always going to get people who...
Yeah, of course. I just feel like, say, for example, there are a lot of other franchises that if you overhauled them in the way that in Final Fantasy 16, where it's kind of a very action-orientated, I understand, that would cause uproar in a lot of other franchises.
Yeah.
Where what I've seen, the reception to the game is that some people are, it's not for me, I prefer, you know, kind of more traditional, but they're not like throwing rocks at anyone. You know, they're not burning the
it
place
does
down.
help if you've got a Final Fantasy 7 just on your doorstep around the
Of
corner.
course, yeah, you're right. Yeah,
Yeah.
they're servicing both. And it's the same with Capcom, I guess.